In light of some of the things that have happened over the last couple of weeks, probably last month, I wanted to do a series on executive axioms, things that may be counterintuitive in some cases. Some they're pretty logical, but I wanted to cover them. And the thing that triggered it for me was, we've had two CEOs under fire. One was let go, which is Bob Chapek at Disney, and Bob Jordan at Southwest. Now, I don't work for those organizations, so I'm just going off of some of the information that people have talked about in the media, which is that Bob Chapek was kind of a cost cutter, and as a customer of Disney, when I go and visit the parks, I've seen some ride breakdowns, a number of things that are in other videos that I've talked about. Some of them very popular, actually. And then Bob Jordan of Southwest, the rumor was he wasn't investing in software. Now, I'm not always an advocate of new software. I mean, that is for the IT companies to push. And I've worked with many of them, and often I was not a proponent of new software um, because the old software was working fine. But there are reasons to change. People are still using COBOL in government, but as a language, and so there's very few people who can code in that language. So there are reasons to upgrade software, especially if it increases the value that you're creating for customers in productivity or any of a number of things. But what I've seen in these cost cutting, I mean, Bob Jordan's still obviously with Southwest. I think he's going to be under fire. But what I've seen is that cutting costs typically in organizations, not all the time, but typically starts out as rather harmless exercise. And one of the most popular ones, believe it or not, that I see, especially in large companies, is don't travel last 2 months of the year or something like that. We're going to cut back on our travel in order to save costs in the organization. But when it starts to get out of hand, the cost cutting mentality starts to replace the purpose and aim of the organization. I mean, sometimes these things can go on very long. I've been in the middle of them, the beginning of them, the end of them, the after effects of them. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this particular video is the counterintuitive things of this focus on costs can increase costs in your organizations. And one of the ways that it happens is all of a sudden, you know, maybe it's a new CEO, it doesn't really matter, but they hire a whole series of auditors and accountants that really don't understand the business, but they're out looking for costs to cut. And that's how they keep employed. But what that does is it avoids the value creation that is typically done when you're pursuing your purpose and aim. In other words, you become so focused on cutting the costs in the organization that everything else is secondary or tertiary, in your organization. But that's one thing that I've seen happen. They also can cut value producing customer facing staff, and I'll tell you where I see it often is in contact centers. Oh, well, they're the lowest paid and we don't really need those folks, and so we'll slash 10, 15, 20%, whatever it is that they need, because we can find another way for that. But then what I've seen in the aftermath of that is worse service, less revenue, complaints begin to increase from customers, and then therefore the costs increase. Another thing is the additional oversight and time of watching people and software to detail the costs. All these things increase costs in organizations that people don't see. You gotta there are many better ways of doing it, but we'll talk about that at the end. Out of control cost cutting, where you start to overcut. You may be you have to eventually, because you overcut, you have to hire new people back. They got to be trained. There's costs involved in that. Or you have to hire back the people that you let go because you overcut. And, maybe they aren't coming in back in at $60,000 salary. They're coming back in at $80,000 salary because you pissed them off. The other things that you see with overcutting is things like cybersecurity, which could be big. Worked with a lot of banks, and cybersecurity is obviously big. Or cutting back on the inventories, and people don't, customers don't have the products that they need, or it disrupts the supply chain. Those increase costs. It could be contracts. And a lot of times I see this, especially with large organizations, because they have some power to be able to go after some of their smaller vendors and say, hey, we want a 10% reduction in our price or whatever. And maybe they can't, maybe they're already on thin margins. In many cases, small companies are working on thinner margins than, let's say, a large company. So those are things that wind up kind of coming back and biting you, and increasing the cost of your organization. One other thing that I see, especially having worked in the aftermath of some of these cost-cutting activities, is it's really difficult if you've gone through a long, and when I say long, I'm going to say at least 6 months, maybe even 3 years, people go through these cost-cutting cycles, and then it's really hard to get people refocused on what the original aim of the company is. And often people will call and say, I need to get my staff motivated, or whatever words that they use. And typically I find out that, well, they've been doing some type of cost cutting, and now people are disenfranchised with the organization because a lot of their friends and people they worked with, are gone from the organization. And, the aim's lost because the focus has been the cost cutting. Another one that kind of comes back, it doesn't necessarily increase costs, but cutting innovation, it can lose you some revenue. And I never suggest anybody cut innovation in the organization. They should constantly have a pipeline of new products and new services in their organization. So those are some of the things that I see, and I'm sure there's a litany of other things that people can think of, and welcome to put those in the comment section below. But the way to go about this is to not focus on the costs, but is to focus on improvement. In other words, we're still constantly going after what our aim, our purpose of our organization is, but we're also constantly looking for new ways to do things. And that's why you can't cut innovation. Hopefully that's part of your improvement of your organization, and that you're seeing new ideas and things of that sort. Otherwise, it does override you. There is something about when you start saying cost cutting that gets people in a particular mode, and a sour mood too as this goes on. Some people like it, especially if you're in the accounting or finance profession. But from an improvement perspective, you have to keep on focusing on what your original aim and purpose was for the organization. So that's what I wanted to cover this week. And remember, there is always a better way.